Welcome to the deep dive. We are so glad you're joining us today because we have quite a mission ahead of us.
We really do.
Today we're going to unpack a really haunting 40-year-old cold case out of St. Louis, Missouri.
Yeah, the St. Louis Jane Doe.
Right. But more than just looking at the history of it, we're going to examine the fascinating, highly complex ways that cutting-edge genetic science is being deployed right now to try and finally solve it.
Which is such an intricate process.
It is. On the afternoon of February 28th, a horrific discovery was made in the basement of an abandoned 24-unit red brick apartment building. This was at Faby 635 Clemens Avenue in St. Louis. It was the body of an unidentified African-American girl. Based on her physical development and bone structure, investigators estimated she was somewhere between 8 and 11 years old.
The details of the crime scene are just exceptionally grim, which is precisely why this case sparked national attention at the time and why it continues to haunt the St. Louis community decades later.
Yeah, it's hard to read about.
It really is. She was found lying on her stomach, and she had been bound at the wrists behind her back with a distinct red and white nylon rope.
And the medical examiner's report.
Yeah, the report determined she had been strangled, raped, and then cleanly decapitated post-mortem. They suspected a large carving knife was used.
Just brutal.
When she was found, she was wearing only a yellow long-sleeved V-neck sweater. And notably, the manufacturer tags had been completely removed.
Which feels so deliberate.
It does. And her fingernails were painted with 2 coats of polish, one red and the other purple.
You know, the removal of the tags, it almost feels like an early attempt to obscure her identity or hide where the clothing was purchased.
That's a very common theory.
And what makes this investigation so incredibly difficult is that her head has never been found.
Never.
Without it, traditional forensic methods hit an immediate brick wall. They can't do facial reconstruction to release a sketch to the public.
Right, no clay models, no drawings.
And they absolutely cannot use dental records to confirm her identity. But as I was reading through the materials on that recent 2022 documentary, Our Precious Hope Revisited, I noticed a major revelation that completely flips the script on what the public thought they knew about her discovery.
Oh, the shift in the narrative there is substantial.
Right.
For decades, the widely accepted story, the one propagated by all the early media reports, was that she was found by 2 older men who were out scavenging for scrap metal and copper wire in a completely desolate, abandoned area of the city.
Like some isolated wasteland.
Exactly. But the documentary investigators tracked down the original reports and found that she was actually discovered by 2 older teenagers. And they'd simply wandered away from a family barbecue happening nearby.
That completely changes the mental image of the crime scene for me.
Yeah.
It wasn't desolate at all.
It's not even close.
The documentary paints a picture of a neighborhood that was bustling. It was active. There was an occupied apartment building literally right next door to the abandoned one. There were multiple housing projects, single-family houses in very close vicinity. Locals from the era described it as a neighborhood where kids were always running around playing. There were schools located right near the residential buildings.
Which brings up a really haunting logistical question.
Yeah.
If the area was that active and there was a family barbecue happening just a short walk away, was this little girl actually a local child?
Right, because the perpetrator took immense risks transporting a body into a building in a populated neighborhood.
Exactly. If she was from that community, how is it possible that absolutely no one reported an 8 to 11-year-old girl missing?
It makes you wonder if neighbors just assumed her family packed up and moved away unexpectedly.
Or if she fell through the cracks of some broader systemic issue.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. And unfortunately, the desperate search for her identity in those early days brings us to one of the most unbelievable investigative blunders I found in this entire stack of sources.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to say.
When you look at the timeline, there is a moment that almost sounds like fiction. Law enforcement actually took the victim's blood-stained yellow sweater and the specific red and white nylon rope used to bind her.
The most crucial pieces of evidence.
Right. And they mailed them to a psychic down in Florida.
Yeah. The psychic had supposedly claimed she could gather a psychic impression of the killer simply by touching the items.
I mean,
looking back from our modern vantage point, it is incredibly difficult to comprehend. But it also speaks to the absolute desperation of the police department in 1983.
they had nothing else to go on.
They had an unidentifiable child, no head, no witnesses, and forensic science at the time was severely limited. They were just grasping at straws.
I understand desperation, I really do, but the consequence of that decision is just Staggering,
Yeah.
because those items were lost in the mail.
Gone.
They never made it back. So the most crucial pieces of physical evidence, items that today could be rigorously tested for trace evidence, microscopic fibers, or touch DNA from the killer, they're just gone forever because they were handed over to the Postal Service for pseudoscientific lead.
It is a devastating loss for the evidence locker. Without that physical evidence, the police had to rely entirely on behavioral profiling.
Looking for local suspects with a similar MO.
Right. They needed a known modus operandi that matched the sheer brutality of the crime. And for a long time, the prime suspect was a local man named Vernon Brown.
He lived nearby, didn't he?
He did. He lived nearby on Enright Avenue and had a documented, horrifying history of murdering young girls. He favored strangulation and the use of cords.
That matches the nylon rope.
Exactly. In 1986, he lured a 9-year-old girl named Janet Perkins into his home, bound her with a wire coat hanger, and strangled her with a rope. He was also convicted of strangling a 19-year-old named Sonetta Ford with an electrical cord.
Wow.
Brown was actually executed in 2005, and police suspect he may be tied to up to 20 unsolved murders. Yet, despite extensive questioning by detectives while he was on death row, he never confessed to the St. Louis Jane Doe case.
So without a confession and without the physical evidence, the case essentially sat cold for decades.
It's completely cold.
But the sources show that in 2013, exactly 30 years after her murder, police decided to try a new avenue.
Oh.
Forensic technology had advanced, and they wanted to exhume her body to extract fresh DNA directly from her bones for modern testing.
A very logical next step.
But in yet another massive institutional failure, they couldn't find her grave.
Yeah, the records at the Washington Park Cemetery where she was originally buried had been severely mismanaged.
It was a mess.
It was a victim of terrible neglect and poor record-keeping. The physical monument that had been erected for Precious Hope was essentially decorative. It actually sat atop 3 different graves, and upon initial excavation, none of them contained her remains.
The lengths they had to go to just to find her casket are incredible. I read that they actually had to bring in advanced camera calibration technology.
Such a fascinating process.
Right. They took a single photograph that had been snapped of her casket on the day of her burial back in 1983. And by analyzing the background of that old photo, matching the angles of distant trees and the roof lines of surrounding buildings to the modern landscape, they were able to mathematically pinpoint the precise coordinates of where her remains were actually resting.
It is a brilliant application of geometry and forensic photography.
Truly.
And once they finally unearthed her, researchers from the Smithsonian Institution and the University of North Texas were able to step in and conduct what is known as stable isotope testing on samples of her bones.
When I was going through the notes on stable isotope testing, I found the underlying concept fascinating. It essentially relies on the old adage that we are quite literally what we eat and drink.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Could you break down how analyzing a bone sample can actually tell us where someone lived?
Certainly. It comes down to the geological signature of water. The groundwater in different regions of the country has varying ratios of specific isotopes, like oxygen and strontium.
Okay.
Oxygen isotopes are tied to the local water cycle, and strontium isotopes are tied to the ancient bedrock that the water filters through. When a child drinks local tap water or eats plants and animals raised on that water, those specific isotopic signatures are deposited into their growing bones and teeth.
So it leaves a geographic fingerprint.
Exactly. By analyzing the mineral content stored in her remains, scientists can compare those ratios to known geographic maps. The test results for Precious Hope concluded that she likely spent her entire life in the southeastern United States.
So states like Florida, Georgia, Texas, the Carolinas.
Right, or Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. Following this testing, her remains were finally reburied with dignity in the Garden of Innocents at Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis.
So the science gives us a geographic puzzle piece. We know roughly where she lived, but it still leaves investigators completely blind to her actual identity. How do you identify a child with no head, lost physical evidence, and who may have been transient?
That is the ultimate question.
And the answer lies in the DNA pivot, specifically forensic genetic genealogy. When I was reading the primer from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, I noticed they spent a lot of time contrasting traditional police databases with this new genealogical approach.
They're fundamentally different tools.
Right, they kept using these terms STR markers and SNPs.
Mhm.
I know they both relate to DNA, but how does shifting from one to the other actually change the mechanics of an investigation?
It changes everything about the scope of the search. Let's start with the traditional method. Traditionally, law enforcement relies on a national database called CODIS.
Right, we hear about CODIS all the time on TV.
Yeah. CODIS analyzes what are called STR markers, which stands for short tandem repeats. You can think of STR analysis like a security guard checking a very specific ID badge. It only looks at 13 to 20 highly specific locations on the non-coding parts of the human genome.
So it's pretty limited.
Very. And it was designed this way deliberately for privacy reasons. It doesn't reveal your eye color, your health risks, or your ancestry. It is only useful for finding a direct one-to-one match to a known suspect already in the system.
Or maybe a parent-child match.
Right. At most, confirming a direct parent-child relationship. It simply does not have enough data to accurately map out distant family trees.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The EFF primer explains that forensic genetic genealogy, or FGG, throws that limited ID badge out the window. It doesn't use those 20 STR
Here it
markers.
goes much further.
Instead, it uses over 500,000 markers called SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. If STRs are a quick ID check, SNPs are like reading someone's entire biological biography. They span the entire human genome.
That great analogy.
Investigators take the victim's comprehensive SNP profile and upload it to open, consumer-facing genetic databases like GED Match or Family Tree DNA.
And this is where the algorithmic power comes into play. Unlike CODIS, which is searching for a direct hit, the proprietary algorithms on these consumer sites are designed to find biological relatives among all the public users.
Anyone who has voluntarily uploaded their DNA.
Yes, they measure these shared genetic connections in units called centimorgans.
Centimorgans.
The basic rule is that we share longer, unbroken stretches of DNA with our closest relatives. So a higher centimorgan count indicates a closer relationship. By finding users in the database who share certain amounts of centimorgans with the victim, a genetic genealogist isn't looking for the victim herself. They're looking for her distant cousins.
It's like looking at a massive family tree from the outer leaves and meticulously working your way down the branches to eventually find the trunk. You find a third cousin, figure out who their great-grandparents were, and then trace every single descendant of those great-grandparents forward in time until you find a missing child who fits the description.
It's tedious, but incredibly effective.
And in the case of Precious Hope, there was a massive glimmer of hope. Parabon Nanolabs, the private company handling the FGG search for this case, actually found 2 close relative matches for the little girl.
They were very close.
The genealogist's work in the case was incredibly optimistic. They stated they believed the identity could be solved in a week.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, though, we see exactly why that timeline evaporated.
Yeah, why didn't they solve it?
The case stalled heavily because tracing African-American ancestry presents massive, heartbreaking historical roadblocks. Building a family tree backward requires public records.
Birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data.
Right. But because of the horrific legacy of slavery in the United States, the historical erasure of records, and the forced systematic separation of families, building accurate genealogical trees for Black Americans is incredibly difficult.
It's a huge barrier.
For many genealogists, the 1870 census is a brick wall. It was the first federal census to list formerly enslaved individuals by their first and last names. Prior to that, documentation is often scarce, inconsistent, or completely non-existent.
And beyond the historical paper trail, there's the complex human element. The course has mentioned that investigators actually reached out to the family of one of those close DNA matches.
They did.
The specific person who had submitted the DNA kit to the consumer database had actually passed away. But when law enforcement contacted the family members managing the estate to ask for help mapping their family tree, the family completely refused to cooperate.
They shut it down.
They explicitly told law enforcement to never contact them again, and they immediately removed the DNA kit from the public database.
It is a profound reaction, and it introduces a significant layer of ethical friction into the investigation.
I have to play devil's advocate here because my initial reaction reading that was intense frustration. You have a murdered child, a little girl who was decapitated and left in a basement. You have the genetic key to giving her a name, and you refuse to help.
It's a hard pill to swallow.
It feels almost unconscionable.
Mm.
But on the flip side, when I read the Electronic Frontier Foundation's arguments, I started to understand the deep-seated fear of voluntarily handing over your family's biological blueprint to the state. especially given the historical relationship between law enforcement and minority communities.
That tension is exactly what the EFF source is highlighting. The EFF goes deep into the privacy debate surrounding FGG, framing these searches as genetic dragnets.
Dragnets.
Their argument hinges on the fact that when a consumer uploads their DNA to one of these commercial sites, perhaps just to find out about their ancestry or health traits, they aren't just making an individual choice.
Right, it affects everyone related to them.
They are making a privacy choice for their entire extended biological family. They are opening up relatives, people who never consented to have their genetic markers scoured to law enforcement scrutiny. The EFF points out that this operates in a massive regulatory gray area.
And the regulations are incredibly sparse. The EFF notes that currently only 2 states, Maryland and Montana, have enacted strict statutory limits on law enforcement's use of forensic genetic genealogy.
Only 2.
Maryland's law, for example, is very rigorous. It requires judicial authorization before a search can occur, it places strict limits on the covert collection of DNA from relatives, and it mandates that FGG only be used for the most severe crimes. But in most of the country, there is no such framework.
We're operating in the complex space between the desperate moral imperative to solve horrific cold cases and the fundamental constitutional questions regarding warrantless government searches of biological data. It is a rapidly evolving frontier of law and science.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about the intricacies of a cold case from 1983 or the policies surrounding DNA databases?
It's highly relevant today.
It really is. Well, looking at the internal St. Joseph Police Department directive on cold case management we reviewed, we learn a crucial operational reality. These cases are never truly closed.
No, they stay active.
The directive mandates that cold cases are to be fully reviewed every 5 years or immediately whenever new forensic technology emerges. They are required to systematically reevaluate the physical evidence, re-interview witnesses, and assess new solvability factors. This means the investigation into the murder of Precious Hope isn't just a piece of history. It is a continuously active, living investigation.
And because it is active, the lead detective on the St. Louis Jane Doe case has issued a very specific, modern plea.
To the public?
Yes, because African Americans are currently underrepresented in these commercial genetic databases, partly due to the very privacy concerns we just discussed, the investigative team is asking the public to consider participating.
What are they asking for, exactly?
They are asking individuals to upload their genetic data to open sites like GED Match, and most importantly, to explicitly opt in to law enforcement searches. The hope is that a new, perhaps closer familial match will populate in the system, bypassing the dead ends they've hit so far, and finally give this little girl her name back.
It's a heavy request that asks you to personally weigh the scales of justice and privacy. As these DNA databases continue to expand, experts predict that in the very near future, up to 90% of the population could be identifiable simply through the uploaded DNA of a third cousin.
90%.
You wouldn't even need to be in the database yourself to be found. So we leave you with this final thought to mull over. As this technology inevitably maps out the entire human family tree, where do we draw the line? Does the moral imperative to finally identify a nameless, murdered child outweigh our fundamental individual right to genetic privacy?
It's an incredibly complex question, and as the science outpaces the legislation, it is a question we will all have to answer sooner rather than later.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time.